Okay, we're moving on with our FAR bar as is 5, the contract, most recent contract that was revised as of April of 2017. Section 9, this is covering Section 9. Now, this is closing costs, fees, and charges. This is going to kind of break down some of the closing costs and all the fees that the contract stipulates is to be paid by either the buyer or the seller. And but it also just note again, once again, that this contract may be amended, and if there are other things in the addendums, let's say later on we add some certain riders that change things, and those would supersede this. But barring there being anything else in writing, this is the law of the land, if you will, that the contract will dictate. Let's start up here at the top. Closing costs, title insurance, survey, home warranty, special assessments. Now they break it down to Section A. These are the costs that are generically to be paid by the seller. Dock stamps on the taxes, insert taxes on the deed. That's kind of standard. Again, all these are negotiable items. Anything can be negotiated away, but this is standard. The dock stamps on the title and on the taxes in the deed. Owner's policy and charges if paragraph 9C1 is checked. We're going to go down here, and it's 9C later on down a little further. We'll see 1. We'll get to that in a second. Title search charges if paragraph 9C3 is checked. All right, we'll talk about that. Hey, catch this. Municipal lien search if paragraph 9C1 or 3 is checked. Now, we're going to talk about municipal lien. Municipal liens are different than other types of liens. Liens, a mortgage is a lien on the property. There may be a public body lien. A municipal lien may be something that's a code enforcement. Let's say that the old owners had not mowed their lawn and they got a civil judgment or something was placed against them against the city for a code violation, then those would be considered municipal liens. However, those aren't normally found. Realize this, that even if you are representing the buyer, and if 9C1 or 3, which 9C1 is the one that is chosen more often than not, probably a good 80% of the time, then the seller is still responsible for paying for a municipal lien search. So, but the buyer, you're going to have to go out and get this. Most title companies will not automatically do that. You need to request that it be done, and if you've already got a fully executed contract, as a buyer's agent, you can ask that be done and that cost be paid by the seller, because this is here. Realize that if you are representing the seller and they choose 9C1, which says the seller is going to choose the title company and pay for the owner's title policy, then you are agreeing to paying for that municipal lien search. So unless it's amended, that's what happens. HOA condominium association estoppel fees, that's getting a letter saying they're good in good standing if there is an HOA. Now the HOA rider talks about that later on when you use that, or a condominium rider as well. Recording and other fees needed to cure title. So if there's a defect in the title and there's things that need to be done, then the seller agrees to pay that. The seller's attorney's fees, other items could be placed in here. All right. Now, just a quick note on this. If prior to closing, seller is unable to meet the as-is requirements as required by paragraph 11, then a sum equal to 125% of the estimated cost to meet the as-is requirement shall be escrowed at closing. If the actual costs to meet the as-is exceed the escrowed amount, the seller shall still pay the difference and any unused portion of the escrowed amounts. Now, what does this all mean? That means that if we go down to paragraph 11 real quick, we're going to go all the way down to 11 because it references it. It's property maintenance. It says, except for ordinary wear and tear and casualty loss, seller shall maintain the property, including but not limited to lawn, shrubbery, and pool, and the condition existed as of the effective date. So what they're saying is this, that they can't let the property go to hell in a handbasket for all intents and purposes, right? Just because they went to contract, they have to maintain it. And if they didn't maintain it, and there's something that is exceeding normal wear and tear, then this says that, oh, we can't just then forget it, don't close. No, we're going to close, and we've got an estimate that it's going to take $2,000 to get this back up into condition that it was at the time of the effective date. And we're authorizing the title company to hold in escrow 125% of that $2,000, which in our case would be basically $2,500 in escrow. And then the work can be done by the buyer after the case. If it's done for less than that, then the difference goes back to the seller. If it takes more, then the seller would still agree to or be liable for more. So realize that paragraph's there. A lot of people don't. Now, these are the costs to be paid by the buyer. These are some of the things that you would normally expect. These are all basically financing items. Now, the owner's policy and charges, well, how does this appear? Well, it depends on which one's checked, right? This is up here, it's if 9C1 is checked, and here this is if 9C2 is checked, then the buyer is agreeing to pay for the policy and charges. The buyer will pay for the survey because that's usually a lender required document, a lender's title policy and endorsements, any transfer fees. Now, again, municipal lien search, but why again? Only if 9C2 is checked. Now, see, it just depends on what box we check down here in a minute to see who's going to pay for those things. Loan, appraisal, buyer's inspection, buyer's attorney, all property related insurance, and then owner's policy premium. There's a difference in title policy, but a policy premium, if paragraph 9C3 is checked. 9C3, just a quick heads up, that's regarding Miami and Dade. We do have a few agents working that area, so just be aware of that. Okay, title evidence. Title evidence insurance, at least blank days. All right, now again, it defaults to 5. I suggest you do this. I put 15 in my example because I think it should be done. You should get your hands on this sooner than later. Quick word on title evidence and title insurance. There are many times where obviously the bank, if you're getting a loan, if the buyer is getting a loan, will want to review that and make sure that the title is secure. If, and I repeat again, I think I covered this in the financing section, if the buyer is electing to choose cash and pay cash, I highly suggest that you encourage them in writing and have them acknowledge that they have the right to have a title policy done. And not only that, but somebody review that for them. Somebody like an attorney review that title policy to make sure that they're comfortable. They're spending a lot of money. It's worth every penny to spend, a couple $100 extra to have an attorney review the title insurance commitment to look after them. All right. So give yourself plenty of time. So if there are any issues, you can get those resolved. That's why I asked for 15 instead of 5. All right. Again, negotiable item, but just make sure it's there. Issued by a Florida licensed title insurer with legible copies of instruments listed as exceptions attached thereto. The title commitment needs to be in place, in this case, 5 days prior to closing. I like it even sooner than that. And after closing, an owner's policy of title insurance, see Standard A, which we'll cover when we start to cover the standards later on in the contract, shall be obtained and delivered to the buyer. See, what happens is you get a title insurance commitment prior to closing, and then after closing, once the deed has been fully signed by the seller and it's been recorded by the proper authorities, then within 30 days after closing, the actual policy of title insurance comes after closing. Shall be obtained and delivered to buyer. If seller has, this is something a lot of people don't know is there. If the seller has a current owner's policy of title insurance covering the real property, a copy shall be furnished to buyer and closing agent within 5 days after the effective date. So let's say they bought it 5 or 6 years ago and they have a title policy, all right, title insurance policy, then you have the rights as a buyer's agent to request it. And if you're representing the seller, the buyer has a right to request it, and you can provide them a copy of that so that they can begin to review it. It may help them going forward as they're trying to just get it updated based upon the old policy. The owner's title policy, premium title search, and closing services, collectively the owner's policy and charges shall be paid as set forth below. Here's we're going to start checking those boxes we talked about before. As set forth below, the title insurance premium charges for the owner's policy and any lender's policy will be calculated and allocated in accordance with Florida law, but may be reported differently on certainly federally mandated closing disclosures. That's all more TRID stuff where they're talking about those documents that they may separate those fees out so that one side isn't seeing what the other side is doing necessarily on every deal. The lender and the TRID may require that. For purposes of this contract, municipal lien search means a search of records necessary for the owner's policy of title insurance to be issued without exception for unrecorded liens pursuant to chapters 159 or 170 of Florida statutes in favor of any governmental body, authority, or agency. This municipal lien search would cover like things like we said, code enforcement things and all that stuff that you maybe even a simple water bill. Sometimes municipalities are the water company, and so you might find unpaid water bills that may be hindering clear title being delivered. So again, who pays for that? Back up there, it was either the buyer or the seller, depending on which box is checked. Now in this one, seller shall designate the closing agent and pay for the owner's policy and charges. And buyer shall pay for the premium for the buyer's lender's policy, which is usually called a simultaneous issue, where there's a lender policy that goes on top of the owner policy, and charges for the closing services related to the lender's policy. Endorsements and loan closing, which amount should be paid by buyer to closing agent or such. So in this one, we're saying the seller's going to choose the closing agent, the title company, and pay for the owner's policy, which is the bulk of the title insurance policy. A lot of times um, uh, the simultaneous issue is significantly, it's like $350 more additional charge, where the bulk of the policy is paid by the owner, in this case, or whoever's paying for the owner's policy. All right. Now, quick word of warning here. All right. This is saying the buyer will pay for their own closing fees related to that. You need to, if you are not going to control as the buyer, if you're not going to control what closing agent is used, this is a blank check. We have seen fees going through the roof right now being charged to the buyer for a closing fee. What I suggest, first of all, you can talk to some title companies and say, hey, look, if I had my buyer close their part of the deal here with you, and I write that into the contract, how much would it be? And a lot of times what I did is I would get an estimate from my title company that I was comfortable with, and then I would write later on into the contract somewhere that the closing fee charged to the buyer shall not exceed X amount of dollars, and if it is, then I would consider moving the title policy or having someone else control the buyer, hire a different title company to close their side of the transaction, because sometimes they can be really exorbitant and there is no control here. There's no way for us to stop it. It's just like, too bad, here we are at the closing. All right. Now, one way to alleviate that is the buyer shall designate the closing agent and pay for the owner's policy and charges. All right. Well, that's not so good either, because now you're paying for something that typically, again, not everything's negotiable, that typically is a seller cost. So all these are just, if this is chosen, by the way, remember, if this is chosen, then that buyer would be responsible. If 2 is chosen, then the buyer would be responsible for the municipal lien search and so on and so forth. So just be aware of that. I would talk to your title companies that you are dealing with and get a good lowdown on what they can do and ways you can go about this. This is the Miami-Dade provision. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. If you deal with Miami-Dade and Broward County, then read this. This is what appears to be their standard that they use. All right. Section D, survey. The prior to the title evidence deadline, which was 15 days in our case, 5 days that we noted above, prior to closing, buyer may at buyer's expense have the real property surveyed and certified by a registered surveyor. If the seller, again, just like remember that if the seller had a title policy, then they have to get it to us within 5 days, or we have the right to ask for it and get to us within 5 days. If the seller has a survey covering the real property, a copy shall be furnished to buyer, just like the title policy was there. You have the right to ask for that. Here's where you can negotiate a home warranty. Home warranties are never a bad thing. We always at least offer them to our buyers and or our sellers. In this case, I put not applicable. It's not being offered. Sometimes the buyer's asking the seller to pay for a home warranty and not to exceed X amount of dollars, $450 issued by Old Republic Home Warranty, blah, blah, blah. A home warranty plan provides for repair or replacement of many homes' mechanical systems and major built-in appliances. You can get the information on those things. All right, now special assessments. I'll try and finish this up because I don't think we'll be under 15 on this one, but we'll be close. Special assessments. At the closing, the seller shall pay for the full amount of liens imposed by a public body. That's not including a condo or a homeowners association, because those are different bodies, and those are addressed in the condo rider or the homeowners association rider that we cover later, that are certified, confirmed, and ratified before closing. So if we know there's a bill due and the seller's aware of it, it's been clear, then the seller has to pay for it before closing. And in addition, number 2, the amount of the public body's most recent estimate or assessment for an improvement which is substantially complete as of the effective date. So let's say as of the effective date, that 90% of this deal is done, and they got a pretty good idea that it's going to take X amount of dollars left. This contract says that the seller is still responsible for the full amount of that whole assessment. What could the assessment be? It could be a street paving assessment. It could be a a tax, just a one-time tax increase. Again, these are not homeowners association assessments. Those are different because those are there as well. But these are things assessed by a public body, whether it be a city, a county, some other municipality that's doing this. And so, again, you might get into a little bit of a fight about if it's substantially complete, but there's probably case law. If you get to that instance, you might want to just be aware. If you see the streets being dug up and all that kind of stuff, you just might want to check in and say, hey, look, what are the known assessments that are in place? And do you know if the seller is currently responsible for any of that? Okay. Now, sometimes they say, all right, there's some special assessments that are coming. They're going to be paid in installments. Here, you got different options. You can choose A, where the seller will pay the installments prior to the closing, and then the buyer will take over after that. You have to disclose what they are. That's the most common. Or the seller shall pay the assessments in full prior to the time of closing, even though we know it's going to continue on another year after the closing. If you checked box B, then the seller would have to pay for those up front. All right. It says if neither box is checked, then A shall be deemed selected. That's the default. And then this paragraph 9F will not apply to CDD, Community Development Districts, which like West Chase in the Tampa Bay area is a very common CDD. All right, those are going to be covered under Standard K. We'll talk about those later. Those are prorated at closing because that's an ongoing thing. Prorated at closing, like the taxes, the prorations can get a little tricky to understand because taxes are paid in arrears and generally CDDs are paid in advance. But we can work on that and have a good title agent disclose that to you and go over that with you. But all that, we just want you to know that for the purpose of this contract, the CDD is not falling into these prorations, even if we've agreed upon it here. All right, Standard K dictates how we handle those. So, quick summary. All right, you've got the standard cost paid by the seller, standard cost paid by the buyer. Title evidence, get it in plenty of time so you can review it. Make sure if you do a cash deal that you still have your cash buyer hire an attorney or recommend that they hire an attorney to review the title commitment, and then so that they have it well in advance of closing. And then you check on who's going to choose the title and pay for the closing costs. Beware of the buyer's costs that can be lumped in here. All right, so find a way to make sure that you're trying to protect your buyer there. Miami-Dade, survey, home warranty, special assessments, we ended up and finished out there. All right, a little longer than 15 minutes. Sorry about that, but that was kind of a meaty section. Thanks, guys.